How's it going, everybody, and welcome to episode 201 of Master My Garden podcast. Now, this week's episode, we're looking at gardening jobs for November. And I suppose some of you listening are probably saying, what's he coming up with a list like this for, considering how wet things have been? We want to, I suppose, avoid the garden. It's been so wet. It really, really has. The last few months have been extremely wet. You know, going back as far as July, which was the wettest July on record. August was up there, not quite as bad as that, but definitely up there in terms of the wettest months. And as we know, September, October, and the first few days of November have been no better. So ground everywhere is quite wet. And I suppose when things are like that, it can mean that you, I suppose, lose interest in the garden, particularly at this time of the year. You know, it is winter time. There is less to be doing. And I suppose you can lose interest. The one thing I would say is it can be hard to stay motivated, but work that you can get done at this time of the year really does take the pressure off and set the foundations for, you know, a fabulous garden next year, whether that's your veg garden or your ornamental garden. It really can. You can lay such good foundations at this time of the year, and there is no urgency on the work, I suppose. So you can do it piece by piece, bit by bit over the next while. So that's what we're going to look at today. I kind of have, 7 or 8 of the, the most obvious jobs that we can be doing at this time of the year. I'll also tell you some things that I'll be doing myself, mostly around the tunnel and changing some things in there. So to get into it anyway, at this stage, vegetable garden wise, interestingly enough, last weekend I planted my garlic and onion sets, some of it in the tunnel for a really early crop and more of it then outside. And obviously I've mentioned how wet it has been, and I don't need to tell you that. You all know, I'd say, from your own gardens, no matter what part of Ireland you're in, you have experienced a lot of wet, a lot of rain over the last few months. But interestingly enough, planting the garlic outside into no-dig beds that were created last February, and while the ground is, there's definitely a lot of moisture in it, the top of the ground was just so easy to work with and not at all heavy and stodgy, where you'd plant your garlic in and it could rot because it was so wet. Not like that at all. It was workable. I won't say dry and friable, but certainly workable and perfectly fine for planting in onions and garlic. And that has and is a massive benefit that I know lots of people talk about, and one that is very obvious to me now in terms of creating no-dig beds. The fact that you can work on them and work in them and harvest from them even in the wettest of times. And I think that has to be a major, major plus, especially given, I suppose, the last few months that we've had. So that to the first point, and that is jobs for November: to mulch and feed your soil. And what we're talking about here basically is clearing off any weeds. And I say that, and I have a lot of weed clearing to do. As I mentioned on a few episodes previous, I've let some of the borders go to pot here over the summer while concentrating on the vegetable garden, and they really need to be got back into order for next year. So what I need to do is get any weeds out of it, and there is quite a lot in it. Cut back any perennial shrubs that are there, tidy them all up. I need to edge them as well. So I'm going to put a stone edge around them all now, and then I'm going to layer cardboard and compost on top, and that's going to hopefully leave them in a much more manageable state for next year, and so that they'll be able to be kept somewhat tidy and look a little bit more presentable going into next summer. So mulching and feeding your soil at this time of the year. So in the vegetable garden at the moment, I have dressed all the beds with a little bit of compost. Even the ones that are still in use, I've sprinkled a little bit of compost on top. And I've also sprinkled biochar onto them at this stage of the year, and basically prepping them and feeding the soil for the winter time. I don't have any bare ground as such, except for a small patch where I'm digging out potatoes at the moment. And they, even where they're coming out now, that will be covered down and actually turned into new no dig beds going into the springtime once they've all the potatoes out. And that's a huge task at this time of the year, is mulching and feeding your soil. Leading on to that, then, if you're contemplating or thinking of new beds for next year, from now right through to the end of February is the perfect time to create no dig beds. And we spoke about it numerous times on the podcast previously. We've had no dig expert Charles Dowding on previously, and as I say, November through to the end of February, you can create no dig beds on pretty much any type of soil or ground. And what that involves for an initial startup of creation of a bed is covering down either a grassy area or a weedy area with layered cardboard. And that's brown cardboard with no plastic on it. So no shiny outer, taking off any plastic tape that might be on it. Creating a seal over the ground with this cardboard. If you're applying it on a very dry day, just give the cardboard a little bit of a sprinkle of water. And then on top of that, you're going with kind of 15 centimeters or 6 inches of compost. Now that sounds like a lot, and it is quite a lot in year one. But going forward, then those beds, once they're topped up every year in the sort of mulching and feeding of the soil in the autumn or early winter, you're looking at just applying an inch after that. So you're going to use a lot of compost on the initial one, but after that you're going to just be topping up. So it's really, really simple. But now is a great time, as I say, now right through to the end of February is a great time to create no dig beds. Next job for the month of November, and it's a really good time as well to do this, is right through, I suppose, until end of January, I guess. But November is a really good month, is for taking hardwood cuttings. Now, hardwood cuttings are, I suppose, they're different, obviously, than the softwood cuttings that you take in the summertime. You're going to have next to no leaf on these. In most cases, there will be no leaf. And you can do it on a lot of flowering plants. So things like hydrangeas, buddleias, viburnums, roses, Philadelphus, the mock orange, and any of those. And there's lots of others as well, like climbers, jasmine, and so on. And there's lots of those flowering plants that you can take hardwood cuttings of this stage of the year. Hardwood cuttings can go directly into the soil outside, and they can be left there. You're typically taking quite a big cutting, so it's going to be typically 12 inches, 30 centimeters long, possibly the thickness of your finger, and you're just basically going to put them into the ground outside or into a pot with a good clay mix in it. And by next springtime, you will start to see roots on those, and they'll be able to be dug up sometime in the early summer and move to either potted on or move to a location where you want to grow them on. And it's a brilliant time, as I say, for doing that. A lot of other plants and shrubs, a lot of hedging plants, evergreen hedging plants can be grown by hardwood cuttings at this time of the year. I'm thinking of things like laurel, privet, that we spoke about last week in the episode on hedging. They can be grown at this time of the year. So hardwood cuttings is the next thing on the list as gardening jobs for November. The next gardening job for the month of November is the planting of bulbs. And obviously that bulb season has been going on for a few weeks. And we have spoke about it before on previous episodes, most notably 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago with Esker Farm daffodils. But you still have lots of time. So planting things like, especially tulips towards the end of the month. November is the best month for doing that. Daffodils, crocus, they can all still be planted. So you still have loads of opportunity to get your bulbs into the ground. I know that there's still a lot of bulbs out there. Reason being, I suppose, because it has been so wet through September and October, a lot of them haven't sold out of garden centres, but there is loads of time still. So if you're looking to plant bulbs, especially if you're planting into pots, because you're not going to be as affected by rainfall levels, get them done now. If you're planting into the open ground, obviously you need to kind of wait for a little bit of a drying if you can get that. but definitely get them in. Tulips especially, but also daffodils, crocuses, and other bulbs can still be planted. Another thing to do in the month of November, and it's a really important job, a really useful job that a lot of people do, but probably not enough, to be fair. So you'll see on every footpath, on every roadway, on every driveway where you have deciduous trees, you're going to see a lot of leaves on the ground. And leaves are give you a huge opportunity to create one of the best mulches and, I suppose, soil improvers that you can get, and that's leaf mold. So you do need access to leaves, but most people do in their gardens. If not, they have somebody who would be more than happy for them to come in and rake up those leaves, but they are literally gold for your garden. So best way to do it is to get them. There's a very simple way of doing it where you load them up into plastic bags, you seal them at the top, puncture a few holes in it to let a little bit of air through, and then just leave them sit for the guts of a year, and they will break down into a beautiful mulch that can be used on your beds. That mulch can also be mixed with, with other growing media for taking cuttings, for potting on, and even for sowing seed. If you have it broken down enough, it's quite good for sowing seed. So gather up your leaves and make leaf mold. That's another really useful job for this time of the year. The next job, I suppose, is, as I said last week, it's going to be more towards the end of the month of November, but still a very important one, and especially an important one to be planting, and that's the planting of bare roots and root ball plants. So the window for root balls is already opened. They're dug up now, and root balls are essentially, they're shrubs and trees and hedging plants that are grown in the field, and not like bare root where they literally come out of ground as bare roots with no soil on them. Root balls are basically where they take a ball of roots, including the clay, and then they put a hessian mesh around it, and that's how you buy it. You buy it root balled. And a very, very economical way to buy trees, a very economical way to buy evergreen hedging plants, and you'll tend to get sort of slightly bigger stock at this time of the year in root ball. Root ball is available now because they don't need to wait for full dormancy. Once you start to get into November, it's okay to lift those. Bare roots, on the other hand, they're a little bit later than normal, as I mentioned last week, because we haven't had any frost yet, and actually a lot of the deciduous plants are still holding their leaves quite late. But what you can plant during the bare root season, and you can start planting it now, is all your fruit trees and bushes. So your apple trees, your plum trees, your pear trees, all of those can be got bare root. Your fruit plants like raspberries, all the different cane plants, black currants, red currants, all of those, joster berries and all of those, and we've spoken about them on the podcast previously. Then obviously your hedging plants, your native hedging, your hedging, a lot of that can be got bare root towards the end of the month. Then obviously trees, the bare root trees, again, a very, very economical way of getting well-established, good quality trees into your garden. I personally here don't tend to plant too many bare root trees. Just the ground is quite heavy here, so I prefer to use potted and not to go in at this time of the year. I like to get them in a bit earlier. But if you're in reasonably good soil, it's a perfect opportunity to plant trees, and you will get bigger trees than you would typically get, in your garden center size tree. You can also buy bare root roses, and it's a very economical way, and you tend to get a good selection, and you can get quite a lot in postage. So if you can imagine you bought 10 roses, they'll fit in a small parcel, because obviously you've no pots, you've no root ball, you're just getting the bare roots. So one small parcel and you get maybe 10 roses. And so that can be, again, an economical way of buying them, but also an economical way of getting them shipped to you. So you can get 10 roses into a small box. So that's sort of the next job, is planning and planting your bare roots and root ball plants. And as I say, covering off hedges, fruit, trees, and roses at this time of the year. The next job is one that I've just mentioned myself, last weekend, planted the garlic and onions, and the window for doing that is, quite small. You would definitely need to be doing that in the next couple of weeks. Certainly by mid to end of the month, you'd want to have that job done and completed. And then the other job in the vegetable gardens you can do at this time of the year, and again, you'd want to be doing that before sort of mid to the third week of the month, is sowing your broad beans. And I've mentioned before that I wasn't a big fan of broad beans, but I did grow them as a bit of a, if I had changed my opinion on them, and grew them this year, really successful, and they were actually beautiful. So my mind has changed, and I will be sowing broad beans in the next couple of weeks. I'm just waiting on emptying the bed of carrots at the moment, and as soon as they're finished, I'll plant in broad beans into that space. So that's another really important job for the vegetable garden at this stage of the year, and that will give you, I suppose, a head start going into next year. I also planted, of the garlic and the onions, I also planted some into the polytunnel, and that will give me, I suppose, a harvest maybe 2 to 3 weeks earlier than the ones I've planted outside on the same day. So it just mean that you'll be a slightly earlier. I'll be harvesting there maybe May, probably end of May. I'll be harvesting from the tunnel, then outside June from my autumn sown sets, and then in July from the seed sown onions that I'll have done in the springtime. And that's how you'll get kind of, a good longevity on your cropping at that stage. So that's the next job, is to plant onions, garlic, and sow your broad beans, I suppose, before the end of the month. The next one is one that I covered on the podcast a few years ago, but it's actually one that I'm probably going to cover again in the next couple of weeks. And it's setting up your wild bird feeding area. And this, tends to be, or has always been, I suppose, a bit of a say you should and you shouldn't feed the birds. And I suppose it has been proven now that through the removal of so many, what would you say, habitats and food sources for birds, that they are now recommending, all of the, the bird agencies are now recommending that it's good to supplement feed the birds in the wintertime. Now, obviously, you still do need to, try and have as much natural food as possible in the area. And generally, there is lots of good work happening now around that, and there is habitats being regenerated and so on. But it's a great time to set up a wild bird feeding area. And when you feed your wild birds, it becomes a little bit of an addiction. Definitely the fun you'll have watching them, and seeing what birds come and identifying them, and especially if you have children who are watching it as well, seeing what birds come, seeing what the different antics of them. I suppose goldfinches being the liveliest of them. If you get them in, they're quite rowdy, and they cause quite a few rows with each other over the food, and you'll have great fun watching them. But it's a good time of the year to set it up. Now, if you are setting up wild bird feeding stations, a few things to watch out for. So you want to get a mix of food. So if you want a mix of birds, you need to mix food. Personally here, I feed peanuts, which is kind of a good general purpose food. But I also feed Niger seed, which is really good at bringing in finches, particularly goldfinches. And so you get a nice mix of birds when you're doing that. In terms of the area itself, it's really important not to just plonk the feeders right in the middle of your garden, because birds, when they're feeding, they need to feel protected and they need to feel safe. And so if you plonk them onto a feeder right in the middle of a garden, they feel vulnerable. And that can be to predators like cats, or it could also be, things like sparrowhawks, which I had a little bit of an issue with early in this year, but don't seem to have any issue at the moment, because I don't think the sparrowhawk was having any great joy. The reason being, a sparrowhawk likes to swoop to a bird table and all in one swoop take the bird and continue flying out the other side. But I have mine positioned quite near a hedge, and that's for that purpose, to give the birds a getaway if they need to. And because of that, then the sparrowhawk that was coming for a few days, he wasn't getting a swoop, or he or she, whichever it was, weren't getting a swoop through the bird table. And so they seemed to move off and didn't cause didn't stay around, didn't really cause any issues for the birds that were feeding there. So really important to get quite close, you know, within a few meters of something that they can get away to. In my case, I have pretty mature Portuguese laurel hedge, and that's a getaway from them. There's also a copper beech tree at the back of it, and then the natural hedge is at the back of that again. So within 4 or 5 meters, they have several places where they can duck and dive away to if something comes, you know, that's going to be predatory to them. And that typically is, as I say, cats or things like sparrowhawks or whatever. Occasionally, it could be a little bit like in our situation here, it could be a Jack Russell who's looking at these and thinking this is a bit of fun to try and catch one. Has attempted on a good few occasions, but once she gets told off enough times when she's doing it, she kind of stops. But yeah, that's the type of predators that we're talking about. Typically, you're looking at cats and things like sparrowhawks. But really great time to set up your wild bird feeding areas. If you are doing that, try, if there is no water sources nearby. Around here, there is quite a few. There's, you know, cattle troughs everywhere. So I don't provide any extra water. There is, as I say, lots of water sources around. But if you're particularly in an urban area, it would be good to add a water source there. So a little water table or something like that, so that the birds have access to water while they're feeding or in that feeding area. I find it your gardening jobs, as I say, planning and mulching, getting ahead of, I suppose, the big spring work is hugely beneficial at this stage of the year. While it mightn't be that appealing to get out with the weather being the way it is, it's definitely not going to stay that way. You know, we will get breaks, we will get good days. Like last Saturday was a beautiful day here, nice sunshine, blue sky. Friday was torrential rain. Sunday there was more torrential rain, but at least Saturday it was a good day, and you could make good progress in the garden. So important jobs again, just to recap: mulch and feed your soil, create new no-dig beds, take hardwood cuttings, sort of last window for planting bulbs, and that's tulips, daffodils, and crocus. Create leaf mould, again, one of the most underutilized resources that we have available to us, and there's leaves everywhere, so just go gather them up and make your leaf mould. Start planting and planting your bare roots and root balls, and again, that's fruit trees, hedges, trees, and roses. Planting garlic, onions, and sowing broad beans in the vegetable and fruit garden. And then finally, set up a wild bird feeding area. And as I say, that's an area, that's a topic before, and I would probably revisit in maybe a deeper way over the next couple of weeks. So that's kind of your November gardening jobs. It's a relatively small list. There isn't a huge amount to be doing, but as I say, jobs done at this stage of the year really do set the foundation and make life a lot easier for the springtime. So if you can get yourself motivated to get out and do it, you will definitely see the benefit and reap the rewards of that next year. In terms of what I'll be doing, there's a new kind of patio area outside. There'll be, and that's lawn. It's a circular concrete pad. It's lawn right up to it at the moment. Over the coming weeks, that'll be edged with stone, and on the inner areas where the lawn is, I'll be covering that down with cardboard and creating no-dig beds that'll be turned into borders next year. All of the plants, or 90% of the plants going into that, will be grown from seed. And yeah, that's going to be, I suppose, the bigger project, the bigger new project, I suppose, going into next year. On top of that, obviously, you have to get some shape on existing beds here and get those tidied up. They're very, very shabby at the moment. I just couldn't keep up with everything this year. So the vegetable garden, fruit garden got all of the attention, and the borders didn't. And they really need it now, to be honest with you, to get them back into shape. The other thing I want to do this year is I'll be rejigging some of the beds in the polytunnel. I collect the rainwater off the polytunnels, so I have about 4,000 litres gathered on that I gather off the tunnel. But the watering system is not working brilliantly. I have a pump is not really strong enough, so I'm just going to have to break it up and go with the porous pipes in smaller lengths. and then try and put some sort of a timer on it so that I want to automate the watering a little bit more in there. Not fully, but automate it certainly a little bit more. And then final kind of job again in the polytunnel is I have a propagation bed, which is, a big bed, 16 foot by 4 foot, that I do all the seed sowing on. And then I just cover it over with little hoops of polythene, propagation polythene. And that's inside in the polytunnel. So effectively I'm creating a tunnel within a tunnel. Reason being, I've open sides on the polytunnel. So what happens is in the early springtime, when you're starting your seeds early, the tunnel is quite cold. But because it's windy in there and it's only propagation plastic that I'm using, it's quite drafty through the bed and the temperatures are not holding in there. So I want to create with Perspex or polycarbonate, some kind of more solid propagation areas within the tunnel. And hopefully that will just allow temperatures to be a little bit more solid in there, especially for starting off seeds and starting off things like some of the tender stuff like your tomatoes and your cucumbers and your pumpkins and all that, just a tiny little bit earlier. And hopefully that will just help with possibly having crops a little bit later on. So as I said to you, they're kind of jobs I'm planning, and that's just a good way to be thinking, is things that you can do now comfortably with no time pressure around them, that will definitely be a benefit to you and your garden next year. So as I say, that's some of the things that I'll be doing over the coming months. So as I said, no real panic. If I have this kind of done by January time, that's fine. So I have a couple of months to do it. Once I don't slack around too much, it'll get done in loads of time for the next growing season. I'll have those new areas created, irrigation sorted out, and a new propagation area within the tunnel. So that's the gardening jobs for November. Very easy with all the rain to get frustrated and to be a bit fed up and not bother with it. But foundations laid now will make things a hell of a lot easier for next year, and will make you more productive and have you better set up and put yourself under less pressure when the busy period comes again next spring. So hope that helped. Next week's episode is a really exciting one. It's from somebody who's really inspirational, and their gardening story is really inspirational. And I know that there's a lot of people listening who follow this person. So definitely check out next week's episode. It's definitely going to be one of the best ones. So that's been this week's episode. Thanks for listening, and until the next time, happy gardening.